So we're going to focus now on a consultancy that we have been spearheading on as from 11 sources in mine side. So in this space, we are going to be spearheading the session for present presenters. So Mona, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Okay, so on the side from ARM, we're going to be spearheading this session on behalf of Maria Camila Munoz, who's a specialist in sales and exports. And on my side, and as a leader from the responsible supply side, and at the same time, we're going to have the participation of the Living Sources team in hand with Rosanna Tufo. She is the lead on the side of raw materials, but and responsible at that. And the presentation on behalf of Jara Pax as also an advisor of this area of responsible raw materials. So, if I may explain a little bit about the persons who will participate, I would like to then get into this. I can, let's go to the next slide, please, Mona. Okay, then. So in this presentation, at this slide, we would like to begin by showing you like the four main points of our consultancy that we've been developing since October of last year to date. And the objectives were mainly, firstly, to do an assessment and a documentation of the mechanisms that were implemented in the market access mechanisms on behalf of the planetGOLD countries during their first phase. So at a second follow-up time or main objective, we had the startup of a training that sought to improve the knowledge regarding the planetGOLD criteria and also to document that connection among the planetGOLD criteria with the work that was done in the project and in the project concerning the elimination in the use of mercury and the legitimacy components. And a little bit further down the line, we're going to give you a little more detailed explanation of what we are referring to when we speak of the planetGOLD criteria. A third important point was also the development of a mobile application in order to assess the conformity with the planetGOLD criteria. So in that space, then we selected a few mining organizations in one of the planetGOLD countries to spearhead this more technologically slanted exercise. And we're going to explain in further detail a little bit further down the road as well. And the fourth important point within the consultancy is to conduct an analysis on these barriers and the success cases in light of this market access component and the supply chains free of mercury, as is one of the main goals that we have in the planetGOLD project. So, to summarize from here on, we're going to do an exploration, a little bit further detail of points 1 and 3 of the presentation and the slide that we're presenting to you for this very first point. The idea is that from the Living Sources team, we can maybe do an assessment and the barriers that we found and the lessons learned. So, and the third one will be developed on our side from Alliance from Responsible Mining arm, and that would be at the last one for the space of this in this area. So the next slide, Mona.
So consider the
So for us to have an advance in this meeting that we're all connected with, we will speak about the countries that form the first part of Planet Gold country. As you well know, Burkina Faso, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Indonesia, Kenya.
So our purpose here is to provide guidance and provide resources in general, but focusing on country. Much like those learnings, we learned that we have to be more from a singular perspective. And so after this, with the next slide, please, Mona, if you'd be so kind. Thank you so much. I will now move the floor to my colleague, Yara, on the first time so that they can conduct this first phase study, the first item. And then we're going to talk about the result of the outcomes, as well as the first phase of the planetGOLD.
Yes. Hi, thank you everyone. And thank you so much, Christian, for kicking us off. I think there were some messages in the chat already. I'm afraid we lost the English translation a little bit at the end there. But I'm sure you will get it back up in order. So yes, thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. It's great to see so many of you here. So my name is Yara Bucks. As already introduced, I'm an advisor and responsible for our materials team at 11 Sources. And I'm doing my presentation today with my colleague Rosanna Tufo, a senior advisor and responsible for our materials team, also at 11 Sources. And we are going to be presenting to you the findings of a study that we conducted about a year ago. Mona, if you could please go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So as I said, we'll present to you today the results of our study in which we assess the progress that the planetGOLD phase 1 country projects have made in integrating artisanal and small-scale gold miners into formal markets. So the purpose of this study was to really identify the key barriers that might hinder successfully supporting miners to access formal market linkages as being done in the planetGOLD program, and to thereby also derive relevant lessons for both the planetGOLD country projects as well as for the wider sector of ASGM, or artisanal small-scale gold mining, market access initiatives. So the assessment that we did was the result of a series of semi-structured interviews that we conducted with the phase 1 planetGOLD country project managers. And those interviews took place between September and November 2023. In addition to that, we also conducted a review of both internal as well as public documentation of the planetGOLD program, really focusing on those 9 countries that Christian just presented as well. To the next slide, please, Mona. So I would like to start today by just really shortly setting out the context of the ASGM sector and really talking a little bit about the structural barriers that artisanal and small-scale gold miners often face in order to integrate into formal supply chains. And that eventually these market access initiatives, including planetGOLD, really aim to address. So the artisanal and small-scale gold mining sector is considered a crucial global economic driver that supports communities and livelihoods across the world. But informality often characterizes much of the ASGM sector, which can really limit miners' access to key resources, including mining rights, but also formal financing opportunities and, of course, formal markets, which is what we're focusing on today. And this could really make it difficult for miners to access fair prices as well as financial support, to thereby also make their mining operations more environmentally as well as economically sustainable, and generally also to improve their health and safety of the working conditions in these mines. So despite the informal nature of the ASGM sector, the sector also accounts for approximately 15 to 20% of the global gold production, That's at least the latest estimates, but it really highlights the significant role that the ASM sector has in global gold supply chains. But the complexity of these ASM gold supply chains, including producers all the way to traders, as well as processors and refiners, really makes it challenging to establish transparent and formal trading systems. So what we've seen is that international organizations such as the OECD, LBMA, central banks, as well as the World Gold Council, they're all advocating for the integration of responsibly sourced ASM gold into those formal supply chains. And those efforts are also very much aligned with standards such as the OECD due diligence guidance, which generally promotes transparency and the responsible sourcing of ASM minerals more widely. So for this reason, we see that increasingly there's more and more programs and initiatives that are supporting artisanal small-scale gold miners to access formal markets and integrate them in these formal supply chains, whereby they often really intend to create these linkages between these artisanal small-scale mining organizations on the one hand, and then formal buyers on the other hand, under this wider objective that access to formal markets could provide potentially incentives for more responsible mining and trading practices. So what we see is that these ASGM market access initiatives, they typically intend to respond to a lot of these barriers, these challenges that miners are experiencing in accessing formal markets. And so the role of the planetGOLD program is that they also seek to help ASGM miners access formal gold supply chains by collaborating with gold buyers as well as other supply chain actors, to thereby then also incentivize responsible practices and primarily really to facilitate a transition to mercury-free processing in the ASGM sector. The planetGOLD program also established the planetGOLD criteria for environmentally and socially responsible operations, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, but those criteria really serve as operational guidelines for these ASGM actors, and they also align with international standards such as the Craft Codes and the Minamata Convention. So these criteria were really created to also support ASGM actors in documenting their adherence to the requirements of formal buyers, and thereby also support them again into working with these formal buyers. Next slide, please, Mona. So I wanted to also really quickly explain to you how the planetGOLD's efforts to support miners accessing formal markets sits within its wider program. So this theory of change that you can see here, it really shows how those efforts aimed at ensuring responsible mining practices, including mercury-free processing, eventually are also assumed to contribute to access to formal markets. So the adoption of more responsible mercury-free gold mining is really seen as a way to support those artisanal miners to access formal gold supply chains, given that many formal buyers will require that the gold they source has not been processed using mercury, as well as that the gold mining adheres to other environmental and social standards. So in our research, we really focus on that access to formal markets pillar, though here and there we did also look at some of the activities that these country projects implemented under the other pillars, if they indicated that that was connected to supporting miners accessing formal markets. Next slide, please, Mona. Thank you very much. So I'd like to first start with setting out what we started our assessment with, which is just to get a better idea of what are these country projects doing, or what have they been doing under the access to formal markets pillar. And there's quite some differences across the country projects, although they all work within the same framework. We did see that there has been an emphasis on different activities in these different country projects. So where possible, I'll give you a couple of examples, but they're not necessarily exhaustive. Those are already shown in the report that we presented. But what we really found is that these different country projects, they apply different approaches that's very much suitable to the context in which they're working. We also found that in some of these country projects, access to formal gold supply chains was not immediately a project priority. So therefore, we at times also try to get insights into some of the activities, that were interlinked, interconnected to this wider objective. So the following activities, and there will be a next slide as well in a bit. There's a couple of more that we show there, but those are really mentioned as the key interventions. So first of all, several country projects indicated that they conducted supply chain studies, often at the start of the country project, to really map the gold supply chain actors as well as the regulations and potential incentives. So thereby really
Mona, this is Rodrigo, the interpreter. Would you please ask Ms. Box to please speak a little slower? She's
Yes,
going way too fast for the interpretation. Thank you very much.
no problem. I can hear it as well. No worries. So I will start again at the first activity. So several of the country projects, they have conducted supply chain studies to really map out the gold supply chains actors, as well as some of the regulations, so regulatory frameworks, as well as incentives at times, to really help identify what are the existing practices, existing stakeholders within these supply chains, and that could potentially, need to be included in the project in order to support these miners to access formal markets. So one of the examples we found is that the planetGOLD Mongolia project, they published a report that details the Mongolian ASM gold supply chain. They did that in January 2022. So that was very helpful for these country projects to map their supply chain. A next activity was around training, so providing training on the planetGOLD criteria along the supply chain. In almost all the countries, this activity was implemented, and it really promotes compliance with responsible mining standards. So these trainings, they really strengthen miners' ability to engage with the formal markets by really equipping them with the necessary knowledge to meet the legal and regulatory requirements. The third activity that we identified was that several of the country projects supported miners in demonstrating compliance with the planetGOLD criteria by providing different types of tools. So, for example, planetGOLD Burkina Faso, as well as planetGOLD the Philippines, they have indicated that they provided tools to miners to really help them report information, such as equipment purchases, as well as production data, so gold production data, or expenses that they have made in the past. And showing those records is really important to demonstrate compliance to formal buyers. So what we found is that some of the country projects also developed digital tools. So we saw, for instance, in Indonesia, planetGOLD Indonesia developed a Yari EMAS tool. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And in Peru, they developed a Cori app as well. And those apps really allowed miners to share public information and demonstrate their commitments to these planetGOLD criteria, such as mercury-free gold production. We also saw that in Mongolia and in the Philippines, there has been ongoing documentation of compliance with specifically the craft portion of the planetGOLD criteria, which was done by specific craft officers that were trained at these artisanal small-scale mining organizations. A fourth activity was the facilitation of direct engagement with market actors. So that included, for instance, traders or refiners, as well as banks, including central banks. For example, in the planetGOLD Philippines project, there they work together with the central bank to really help associations obtain gold trader accreditation. We also found that in Indonesia and Mongolia, some events were hosted to really connect miners with these buyers, with these stakeholders. Mona, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So a fifth activity that we found was that the planetGOLD Colombia project, they piloted a supply chain mechanism to really establish these formal and mercury-free supply chains by directly connecting miners with local and international buyers that had gone through a vetting system. This really included also leveraging the existing networks of these mines, also through the Fair Mines Authorized Buyers program to really facilitate trades. And 9 international buyers eventually underwent vetting to ensure that they could comply with responsible sourcing standards and source the gold directly from these Planet Gold supported artisanal small-scale mining operations. A sixth activity that we found was that in some of the projects in countries like Burkina Faso, as well as Kenya, Mongolia, there they advocated for better regulations and support from the government by working together with these government authorities to make sure that the regulations that could facilitate miners' access to formal markets could be improved so that it was more suitable to their realities, especially focused on improving gold trading regulations and licensing processes as well. And then a seventh activity that we often found was that in order to really streamline miners being able to access these formal gold markets, some of the projects also addressed logistical barriers that miners faced by advocating for the establishment of gold buying officers closer to these mining sites. So, for example, we found that in Ecuador, the Planet Gold project identified challenges that miners faced in selling gold to the central bank due to the distance of the central bank buying offices. So the recommendations of the Planet Gold Ecuador team to the government eventually led to the establishment of new gold buying offices that were much closer located near these ASGM production sites, which really helped to release some of the burden from the miners to have to travel a long way and also face some of the security risks that they would otherwise have faced. So in that way, it just made it more practically easier for them to sell their gold to these formal institutions. And then finally, as I already mentioned, we also looked at some of these interlinked activities that were implemented under the other components of the Planet Gold program. That was especially the case where countries indicated that they were just more indirectly working on access to formal markets. So, for example, some of the country projects worked on supporting miners' access to financial opportunities, assuming that if they could gain more access to these finances, it would enable them to professionalize their operations, such as by adopting mercury-free processing systems. It then would also have a multiplier effect that could also support them in meeting due diligence standards by moving to mercury-free processing, which could then indirectly facilitate their engagements in these formal markets. We also found that some of the efforts of the country projects to formalize the Planet Gold supported organizations was really about understanding that formalization is essentially also a crucial step in order to support miners accessing formal finance as well as formal buyers. It's often a prerequisite if they want to work with formal buyers, of course. So that's just some of the key interventions that we identified that the Planet Gold program implemented in these phase 1 country projects. So I will now, if you could move to the next slide, Mona, talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that these country projects had reported to us directly during our research. Some of these challenges I really want to highlight as well. They are very much entrenched in some of the existing structural barriers that miners face in order to access formal markets. So although some of these challenges were already there when the project started, we did find that unfortunately some of them proved to be too complex to address within the lifetime of these country projects. So that's just what I really want to stress, that some of this is very deeply within the context of wider barriers of miners. So the first challenge that we found, which is also one that was mentioned the most by these country projects, is that they faced the difficulties in formalizing the ASGM operations within the project lifetime. And that ultimately also affected and complicated the market access activities. So in many of the countries, including Burkina Faso, as well as Ecuador or the Philippines, we found that bureaucratic delays and really complex permitting systems made it very difficult for miners to get their licenses and to operate formally within the formal system. Even when there was an incentive for these miners to formalize, they were also at times still discouraged by these very lengthy processes. And also sometimes concerns about high taxation, for instance. And this informality in the end also really made it very complicated for them to sell their gold to formal buyers, of course, if they were not registered formal entities. Also following these formal requirements of these buyers. Something we also found is that in some of the cases, local traders would also struggle to meet the government requirements. So that made it also very difficult for miners to access formal supply chains, since these informal traders are often the ones that they sell their gold to. I'll speak a little bit more about this in a bit. Another big challenge that we found that the planetGOLD projects were facing was the lack of access to formal financing for these ASGM operators. So in many of the countries where these country projects are working, banks often view, or other financial institutions, they often view artisanal small-scale gold mining as very risky, or as potentially linked to illegal activities, which could often make it very difficult for miners to get loans or any other financial support. So, as we already know, this often forces miners to rely on informal financing, but that's often done through these pre-financing arrangements with informal traders. So then those informal ties would again complicate the ability of miners to sell to formal buyers, because they already have those pre-financing arrangements with informal traders. Something else we found is that without adequate financing, miners, as I mentioned before, they really struggle to invest in mercury-free processing systems or other responsible mining practices, which again complicates their ability to sell their gold to formal buyers. A next challenge we found was around the weak regulatory enforcement and support. So a lack of limited, or lack of government support was often a major barrier for planetGOLD projects. In several of the countries, the governments, they do not have the resources or the capacity to really trace these gold supply chains. Again, also because those gold supply chains often know many different actors. And that often, complicates their ability to enforce compliance with responsible sourcing standards. And the government commitments, as these country projects really showed, is really seen as crucial to ensure that there's transparency in those supply chains by creating an enabling legal environment. The next barrier that we found was that the planetGOLD projects noticed that many of the ASGM producers, as well as traders, struggled at times to realize the purpose of implementing the planetGOLD criteria, which at times resulted in difficulties translating these due diligence requirements and benefits. So in some of the countries, due diligence and traceability were quite new concepts, and it didn't necessarily fit into the norms, into the way that the ASM sector was structured, was carried out. So what we found, for example, in Burkina Faso, is that the idea of due diligence was a very new concept, was very unfamiliar for a lot of the miners, which meant that there was extensive awareness raising needed. We also did find that in other countries, such as Mongolia and Guyana, miners at times did not feel incentivized, let's say, to really adopt responsible mining practices without a direct financial premium on their gold, since they weren't immediately convinced that mercury-free processing could yield the same amount of gold. So also in the Philippines, the country projects found that there was also often widespread misinformation about the requirements of formal buyers, which again required quite a lot of awareness raising at the start of the project. Another challenge we found is around documenting adherence to the Planet Gold criteria. So for instance, record keeping really often proved challenging to realize in these artisanal small-scale mining organizations for lots of different reasons. So sometimes miners were unfamiliar with these monitoring or reporting methods, and they were unaware of what the buyers required to actually see in order for them to sell to them. And we also found there were sometimes issues of illiteracy or a lack of access to technology, or a general apprehension towards documentation, especially for miners that are working informally. But that eventually really made it difficult for them to report compliance. So even in those places where the Planet Gold supported organizations, they were making progress towards compliance. There was still sometimes an issue of actually demonstrating this towards the quality that was required by the formal buyers. A next issue we found was around ensuring traceability. As I mentioned, traceability remains a big concern, since tracking the ASM gold supply chain remains challenging, especially because of the high mobility of a lot of the actors in the gold supply chains, which really complicates traceability to record their purchases. So we also found that electronic record keeping was not always feasible in these remote areas. Could you move to the next slide, Mona? Yes, so I will go a little bit quicker now, if you don't mind, just to make sure we can finish this on time for you. A few of the other challenges that we found was that leveraging adherence to the Planet Gold criteria for market access proved challenging as well, especially for those organizations that relied on informal traders. There was less of an interest, let's say, to move to these responsible mining practices. And that disconnect really meant that compliance didn't always translate into formal market linkages. Another issue we found was the existing ties with informal traders. As I mentioned before, there were often pre-financing arrangements with these informal traders as well, which the miners often preferred over working together with formal or unknown buyers, which again proved really difficult for the Planet Gold country projects to resolve within the lifetime of the projects. Thirdly, a lack of trust, both towards new buyers, but also for miners to organize themselves into organizations or to work together with government authorities, or even sometimes with the Planet Gold project. Took time in general. It took time to build these trust relationships, which again was not always feasible within the life cycle of the project. And then next, the geographic remoteness, as I mentioned before, and decentralization of gold buying offices made it difficult or presented really logistical barriers for these miners to reach formal buyers in these more centralized gold buying areas. Which again, decentralization was attempted by many of the Planet Gold projects, but wasn't always possible within the lifetime of the projects, and since it's a very slow process. And then finally, we found some gender-specific barriers where women face specific barriers to accessing formal buyers, more so than some of the men. And we did find that although the Planet Gold program does have a very specific focus also on supporting women, at times it proved really difficult to support these women in accessing formal buyers within the time available. Yeah, so that's that were our main challenges that we found. I'll now hand it over to Rosanna to present some of the key recommendations that we drew.
And Mona, please go to the next slide. I'll just remind, 2 slides back, the green one, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just remind everyone that if you have questions, please start putting those in the chat function, and then we'll try to take them at the end of this presentation. Thank you. So as Yara said, I mean, we did this analysis really looking at the 9 planetGOLD country projects. And of course, we understood a lot of how they worked on market access to market, but also that also helped derive some more general lessons learned and conclusions that we can really extract. And we try to summarize here a few factors. These are not exhaustive, but we try to at least summarize the key ones that can contribute to support market linkages between ASGM producers and formal markets while implementing responsible mining and sourcing practices. So these focus very much on the actual access to markets. So take a sort of in isolation, hold the rest, recognizing, as Yara just presented, that they're all very much linked, but very much we look at how securing access to markets is important, also to make sure that the programs that support ASM producers are also sustainable and can be maintained in the long term. Next slide, please. So as a first sort of factor, and something that we have observed as Yara presented that took place in many of the country projects that we discussed, there is like an activity which is looking at doing a supply chain mapping or a general market actors mapping. And this really helps understanding who is involved in the trade and in the production, not only the production, but also the trade of gold locally, even before it goes to export, and then of course, further actors downstream, but also how they operate and how they interact across each other, what kind of functions they play, and also what are the key dynamics. This exercise is usually very important also to map the interactions between the formal and informal economic activities. We speak a lot about formalization, and we speak a lot about, supporting miners through the formalization process. But really having a supply chain mapping exercise can really understand how formalization works within the broader economy where the ASM miners operate, and also how it interacts with other actors which could operate in the formal, so they are recognized, but also, as also Yara mentioned, like often traders themselves are also informal, and therefore continue that chain of informality along the trade of the mineral. During this supply chain mapping is also important from the perspective of understanding the more socioeconomic dynamics, not only the pure trade activities and dynamics, but also looking at other social factors and indicators, for example, the identification of specific vulnerable groups and how the trading of gold in this case in particular affects them and what kind of barriers they particularly experience. Again, we just saw that some women, for example, experience very specific gender barriers. As a next step, if we want to look at this in a subsequential manner, once we have understood who are the market actors, we should ask ourselves really what kind of incentives and motivations are there. So when we were doing the analysis of this 9-country project experiences, we tried to do it through the lenses of market system and development approaches, which are widely applied in other commodities, less so in the mineral space, we have to say. But we thought that these were very interesting because they emphasize a lot on the concept of incentives, and we saw that this was coming up a lot in the different country experience, and therefore we thought that this is a very important aspects to highlight. What we mean by incentives is really understanding the broader motivations that move the different actors, not only miners, but also traders or the financiers and other people and organizations along the supply chain, and also see how their behavior, what guides their behavior, because this very behavior could also support or go against the implementation, for example, of responsible mining practices or working in the formal sector and therefore in compliance with regulatory requirements. one of the examples that Yara also brought up, it was also the struggle for some of the mining organizations to see the impacts and the benefits of implementing responsible mining standards. So we saw that this is really emphasizing also the importance of identifying the right incentives and see how responsible practices also speak to the priorities and interests of miners, but also others as traders, as I said. For example, their focus on having earning a livelihood, or aspects on safety and security, etc. So when we speak about incentives, we should not only think about financial ones, but there are also different kind of aspects that can motivate people in their behavior within the supply chains. So once we have sort of like the who, right, we have the mapping of the supply chain, the how it interacts, and the key incentives that move the different actors. Then again, if we want to follow this concept, like consecutive approach, we can think about engagement approaches. By engagement approaches, we really mean how do we really work with the different ASGM gold supply chain actors? How do we engage miners to implement responsible mining practices, but also how do we engage traders to be more mindful of responsible mining practices and so on? So this also really became clear, really, in the analysis that we did, that looking only at the mining activity in the supply chain is really not, Okay, I will try to speak slower. I saw the message in the chat. Okay, I'll try to speak slowly. Sorry, we're just very conscious of time. So yeah, I was saying that isolating only and looking only at mining, at miners, and therefore mining organizations, when we think about this kind of programs, might risk isolating really the system that they are present in from an economic point of view, and also in terms of dependencies. Therefore, the importance of including potentially others like traders. Yara spoke about some examples of even the central banks, financiers, and etc. in these programs that aim at facilitating market linkages. Importantly, what we saw, for example, in the case of traders, is also that they still remain the main and the key intermediary that many mining organizations work with, because of also the remoteness of the location. So it is important to think about their role in these programs and how to engage them on the responsible mining practices. Ultimately, all of this is also bringing to another important point. We speak about market linkages, but there is an importance to recognize that some market linkages already exist. These miners, while they're producing gold, they're already selling to certain traders. It's already going through a supply chain. So understanding how this currently works, and then see how to integrate better mining practices, like the efforts the planetGOLD program has been doing on mercury-free processing, but also all the other topics and criteria, is very important. Next slide, please. Now, two reflections which are less on the approach, but more on how these programs can be designed. So the first is really thinking about how can we recognize the role of these programs in the interaction with market actors. It's important to recognize that programs like the planetGOLD, but others, are not permanent market actors, meaning that they're there as a support function. Sometimes they're time-bound, and therefore the intervention they put in place should then be able to sustain and continue once the program has been finalized. So this usually calls for finding the right balance, which is a difficult one, between direct intervention and facilitation of activities with the different market actors that we identified before. Of course, sometimes because of the very specific challenges of a given supply chain or context, more direct interventions are needed, like direct training or a facilitation of engagement on specific technical capacity building and so on. However, when there is the chance, the focus and the
Rosanna?
attention. Yes.
1 second, please.
Yes.
It's okay, Rosanna.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so I was saying when there is the chance, the facilitation approach should really be the preferred route to go. And what does it mean, facilitation? Is really trying to find ways to work with the market actors so that they own the actions and the activities that are being performed. A couple of examples that we saw, for example, of this facilitation approach is helping bringing together different market actors into partnerships so that then ideally they can continue that engagement and that partnership also after the life of the program. For example, on extraction techniques or also processing techniques, sharing knowledge and so on, as well, of course, on the financial side. Of course, a common challenge with this approach is that usually it's very time consuming. It requires a lot of effort. But again, if we think about the sustainability and the longer term impacts of these interventions, then it's really where we see potential opportunities and advantages with this approach. Lastly, but not least, definitely is also looking at the composition of these programs in terms of the skills that are required. Because of course, when we look about responsible mining practices or supporting formalization, working with rural communities, there are specific, sometimes development or social and economic skills. Here we really see that when looking at market linkages, it's also important to bring in skills that are more specific to business and economics, or the ability to perform market analysis, and therefore then also analyzing them and taking actions as a result of the market analysis outcomes, and etc. And finally, also skills that are specific to the identified market barriers. For example, if we identify barriers that are gender specific, then what kind of skills are needed to address those, or barriers with respect to access to financing, then probably there is a need to bring in experts in terms of financing and impact investing and so on. So these are really some of the high level. We try to take a step back and really reflect on what are some of the principles and factors that we can extract from this work. And for the interest of time, I'll stop here, but keen to take any question. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosanna. I'm just going to ask if Judith, are you on, please? The other French interpreter. I'm in the English channel, Judith, if you can hear me. Yes, okay. What's your, I'm having a hard time finding your name on here, and I can add you. On the, yes, how you logged in. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Let me appreciate everybody's patience. I just need to add an interpreter. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so do we have any questions? And also the PowerPoints will be shared. The presentations will be shared after the session ends. Do we have any questions that we need to address in the chat quickly before we head over to ARM?
Mona, there is one question in the chat.
Okay.
Which Asiatu has translated from the French. The question is there a risk or is there opportunity, I think, for partnership between the miner responsible for extracting the ore and investors, which are interested actors, of course, in the supply chain? And if so, which ones? And if not, how can investment in the business be guaranteed? So are there risks and opportunities also for partnership between the miner responsible for extracting and the investor? So what are the risks and opportunities? And also, what are those? And how can the investment in the business be guaranteed? So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll try to, I'm not sure. I mean, I think I'll try to interpret a little bit the question. I'm trying to understand it. I think it's very difficult to respond in an absolute term, right? Because of course it will depend very much on the specific case that we're looking at. Of course, risks to me are more like with respect to the relationship between the let's say the investor, it depends also on who the investor is, right? Are we talking about a trader? Are we talking about another supply chain actors, for example, refiner or others that are interested in sourcing from ASM in this case? So the risk really depends on also who the actors are and also their understanding of their respective parties, right? Because in our experience at 11 Sources, not only through this work, but also on other projects, is that we see that often there is also need for education on the other side to investors or other supply chain actors to interact with ASM and to really see how they can be considered and treated as a legitimate business really partner, right? We actually speak about that very briefly in the report. It was not one of the main outcomes, but it's something that we touch upon. And in terms of opportunities, I think, of course, there are, and again, it depends really on the specific, but there is the opportunity to take a more longer term approach into working with ASM, maybe cutting the ties a little bit with development programs, right? Because then it becomes more of a business relationship with an investor who's interested in the, let's say, well-being, for the lack of a better word, of the ASM organization, and therefore is willing to create a linkage or a relationship that goes beyond the life of a given program. So that probably, if I have to on my feet to think about a key opportunity and one that can be generic, that's what I would say. But happy to discuss further later if there is time.
I think we can take one more question. I see in the chat here from a Dr. Khan. Dear Rosanna, what kind of professional training can be provided to the artisanal and small-scale miners based in Uganda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Malawi, South Sudan, and Tanzania, specifically so that they refrain from doing illegal mining and do not damage the environment and themselves from mercury usage, which causes diseases?
Yeah, another big question. And again, these are all different countries with very different political, and in some cases even conflict or like challenging dynamics, right? But maybe I can link to my presentation, what I shared before. To me, the first question to ask before we get into what kind of trainings is, what are the motivations of these actors to engage in illegal mining? Right? Why is that illegal mining is happening? What is the potential alternative and why that is not taken? Right? So starting from that as a really first step is a little bit what we were talking about when we were thinking about identifying incentives, because it's very hard to just give suggestions about mining in a better way if then there is no really like a benefit that comes, because ultimately we're talking about economic actors, which at least they want to earn a livelihood. Then, of course, there could be in the legal sphere of mining activities, there are also other kind of motivations which, go beyond just economic drivers, because they could fall into criminality and legal activity. But in general, I think understanding those motivations first and foremost is crucial. So that, as I would say, in terms of type of professional training, one thing that, again, based on also previous experience from 11 Sources that we have seen that it works is bringing training on technology that helps improving the recovery of the material, because that, again, speaks immediately to the economic aspect of mining, because as a miner, if I can recover more from what I'm producing, then there my motivations increase in terms of potentially behaving in a better way and taking care more of other aspects of mining from a socioeconomic or environmental point of view. But again, I need to have the return in a way. I need to see that it's also bringing me value from an economic perspective. So again, very broad question and difficult to have a solution.
Thank you. Thanks, Rosanna, for that reflection. I do want to remind all of our participants that the broader objectives of the planetGOLD program are to promote the use of mercury-free alternatives, and all of the planetGOLD projects include training on and transfer of technology on mercury-free actions that complement the kinds of market access activities that are being discussed on today's webinar. So for more information, please visit planetgold.org and we'll put that link in the chat.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so I think we're going to move on because I want to make sure we have time for questions about the next section. Thank you, Jada and Rosanna, very much. So Christian, just give me 1 minute and I will. Okay, Christian, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Mona, and thank you, Jara and Rosanna, for that wonderful explanation of this first essential point within our session's agenda for today. So we're going to switch gears a little bit right now with the first point that was addressed. The second part of the session that has much to do with the implementation of a pilot application with the end of providing a scope from a technological standpoint to the planetGOLD criteria. So we're going to take about 20 minutes now to explain this portion. And as we have mentioned throughout the session, we have the chat just in case you have any questions or comments. And during the last portion, we're going to have a little space for Q&A that come from the audience. So Mona, if you could help me with the next one. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned to you during the execution of the consultancy, there was a third important point, and that was the application or of a mobile app that would allow us to arrive at these three main objectives. The first one is to provide a GSM to technological tools for documenting compliance with planetGOLD criteria. I'm talking about ASM organization, sorry, I said in Spanish. And second, to conduct an intensive in-person training on the use of the web mobile application. A third point was to develop and implement a monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy to monitor progress using this application to see the lessons learned and points for improvement within this app. So at this particular point, we have the application of a technological tool, but also based on field experiences. As you well know here, the colleagues that are connected here, we know the challenges that organizations and ASM organizations certainly face in the field. So that's why we have to go out to the field and see how we could apply this new technological tool. So Mona, let's go to the next one, please. Thank you. Okay, we're going to explain here a little bit what the scope was for this pilot project regarding its application. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the country chosen to conduct this pilot program was Ecuador. And we there were three ASMOs were chosen in the region of Machala. So a little bit to the left, we present a little bit what the process was that we followed to select these mining organizations and the prior steps taken for their application. So we chose three mining organizations in that prior evaluation. We selected organizations that would have high, medium, or low compliance level. And so this was the intent to compile information from rather diverse organizations. As you can see, ASME, ASM organizations are variable in that sense, and their compliance record is, well, different. So one of the selection criteria was that they would also know and would form part of the Planet Gold program. In other words, that they would also have the necessary knowledge and that they have already had some sort of training imparted to them, which in the case of this particular region where we apply this pilot was already done here. So Planet Gold had already implemented a few activities around this. And during the consultancy, they received training on Planet Gold criteria. Second point was the selection process per se. So we began with a pre-viability format, feasibility format. So we compiled some information that would allow us to know the legal, technical, commercial aspects and some policies as well on risk prevention and money laundering and financing to terrorism aspects and such. After that, there were some confidential NDAs were signed for data. As you know, dear colleagues, that for minors, it's very important the scope at the moment of sharing information. So that was essential for us so that we could continue with the application of this technological platform. And so we conducted a background check and we did our due diligence prior to the application of this tool. Next slide, please. Here we go. Okay, can you click twice so we can see the criteria there? Yeah, that's it. Okay. Okay, so before I show you a little bit about some of the deliverables and results from the technological tool, this mobile platform with regard to the Planet Gold criteria, we wanted to conduct a little pause and better explain or to maybe just give you a friendly reminder on what we're referring to when we mention or when we're making use of these Planet Gold criteria. So here on the left, we see in our screen the craft code. The craft code is a due diligence tool for small and artisanal gold mining sector, and it's divided into several parts. As you can see here, we have a first module for internal management and legitimacy. The third one that has to do with all of the priority risks on the OECD criteria, and the fourth, which are those risks that, according to the guide, are considered around having some mitigation plans to mitigate these. So we can provide certain activities or we can have certain mitigation actions with regard to these risks. And here we're talking about specifically about social and human rights issues and other policies geared towards the preventing terrorist activities and money laundering schemes. So Planet Gold criteria pick up all of these craft codes. Here are the four ones here. And as we can see on the right-hand side of our screen, we have three additional criteria. The first one, very clearly, the focus to eradicate the use of mercury. A second component that has to do with respect to the rights and lives of indigenous peoples. And finally, concrete actions on environmental protection. So that we can have this very clear, my dear colleagues, what Planet Gold is from Module 1 to 4 from the Crown Code Plus, the three additional criteria contemplated within the Planet Gold program. And you can find this information as well in the Planet Gold webpage, there is a space dedicated to criteria. Mona, next one. Thank you. Okay, so very succinctly, we would like to explain to you how this mobile tool works. And we summarize it in 4 steps. The first step is the information gathering. And I would like to take you to the case of a mining organization that would like to apply this technological tool. So these miners, the first thing they have to do is to manage, create a format through Kobo Toolbox. Maybe some of the colleagues here already know about it. And so there are some questionnaires that have to be answered. And besides that information, they load it up to this toolbox and documents and criteria, as were mentioned. Then the second point is that this information is directed to a platform that is called Bloom, which is a mobile app developed by Impact. And this is where Kobo Toolbox, and then this is where it's analyzed. And this is where we can ultimately have a quantification of the information gathered through the Kobo Toolbox app. And once the information is lodged in this platform and we signal went out for a second to another, we can go to a next platform, which is called Tableau. So this is how the information flows through these technological tools. And Mona, if we can go to the next one, please. Okay, so we wanted to show you very briefly an example on how we manage the information in this Kobo Toolbox app. That's point 1 that I mentioned before. And as you can see on your screens, we have a
Perdón, Cristian, es que ahorita no hay inglés. Interpretación en el... Un momento, por favor. Sí, gracias. Just pausing for a moment until we get our English interpreter back on. Thanks for your patience. I don't hear it yet. 1 second.
can you hear me, Mona?
I can now, Rodrigo.
Okay, great.
No
Okay,
problem. Okay, go ahead, Cristian. Thank you.
Christian, go ahead. So, as I had said before, this is a screenshot on the information compiled at the field. And it's important to point out that this information was compiled together with our ARM team. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Mona. So here we can see some of the results from this field visit. And we wanted to show you 3 examples on support efforts that were conducted on 3 different aspects regarding the platform that have to do with firstly, the infrastructure of the mining operations, the processing methods of one of them, and the final gold recovery method. in a practical sense, what is the work done with this Bloom platform? Let's recall that one of the prior presentations I mentioned 4 steps. We already mentioned the first one with Kobo, and the second and third one is through the Bloom platform. And here is where we wanted to point out to you in a clearer fashion how, through what we are presenting to you, we have in one line what the questions were. In another line, we have what type of question it is. It's a simple selection or a document has to be loaded. Can we answer it through text maybe? And what are the possible responses to those questions set forth? And finally, a drafting on each one of the questions. Okay, so I would like to highlight the fact that what Bloom allowed us to do
Sí. Oh, es que otra vez
okay, it froze.
okay. Oh, we didn't
Okay.
hear you, Rodrigo, for a moment. We didn't hear that last
Oh,
part.
okay. I'm sorry. Yes, he goes.
okay.
Set go to the next one, please. Okay, so
Sí,
English is
gracias.
working fine. Yes, okay, great. Yes. All right, yes, so the fourth point for this technological tool is the results visualization. So here we present through the Tableau platform the deliverables from the analyses made from the prior platform. And here we can see a consolidated view of the information compiled. As we can see here, it is fully aligned with the planetGOLD criteria with regard to the assessment of the internal use made and, excuse me, he says, no, the internal control system, he says, and the internal system that the organizations have. These have to do with the craft module, the craft code, module 1, and the priority risks as I had mentioned before, and have to do with the module 3 to 4 from this standard. And lastly, the planetGOLD criteria that, as you well know, the sum of both the craft code plus these planetGOLD criteria equals the planetGOLD criteria. So we have some of the results that were gathered for these organizations. So at least one that where this technological tool was applied to. So Mona, let's see if we can go to the next one, please. Here we wanted to just highlight some of the main inputs or reactions even, or some of the main actions during this field visit. As you well know from the planetGOLD project, we understand that need, or shall we say that importance of being able to apply any type of tool directly with the miners. So we began, or rather, we made strides in 4 main aspects during that field visit. Firstly, uninstalled capacity in these organizations that was left behind, and there was a commitment on behalf of the consultancy that the miners, men and women, would have confidence in using this technological tool. Second, data gathering very efficiently. A third point in reviewing documents and compliance support that were aligned to the actual platform needs. And lastly, and not less important, the possibility of taking these learnings directly from the field. And so next one, Mona, please. summarize into 5 points. The first point is a little bit about the participation of the mining organizations during the pilot program. We saw a very good willingness by the miners, men and women, to make use of this technological tool within their processes. A second point in the feedback process was this adaptation so that the mining organizations provided very good look was that this mechanism could improve in time. And an essential point, the third one, is the promotion of transparency. So the miners certainly highlighted that this tool is very valuable in strengthening all those mechanisms that will allow the ASM sector to contribute so that their operations may be mercury free and regarding human rights, and would also have gender violence prevention processes, and to have a value chain done correctly, and how all this can impact further down the line the transparency on their internal information. And a fourth point, which is a challenge still within this application, is that the miners were told us about the need to find greater incentives, the need for greater incentives. So they feel that the use of these tools and platforms, positive as it may be, it represents additional work for them, and that's a capacity perhaps that they don't have at this or at times, and they can implement, and that their groups of interest are not aligned with these exercises, and it would like for maybe a governmental agency or a financial entity would recognize this effort and would allow them to have a greater approach or become a support, or would work or form part of the support processes in liaising these stakeholders. And the last point to conclude this portion of the explanation of the tool, here we identified a few challenges on that proximity for the use of these technological tools, thus providing greater accessibility with these organizations where this technological strategy was implemented and they could develop it correctly. However, in the assessment that we conducted, we realized that perhaps for other organizations with a lesser technological capability, it's more complex to implement this type of technological tool. So that's the end of my presentation. We are a little, I think, just right on time. We would like to give you the floor now, dear colleagues, on your questions or comments. If you have any opinions in this regard, this is the right time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, if there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat and we can have someone respond, or comments.
Mona, this is Susan speaking for everyone. While we're waiting for our colleagues to gather their thoughts, I wanted to point out to those who are on the call who are planetGOLD Country Project staff, we will be continuing to work with ARM and their partners to further develop, yes, Bagana. I'm answering your question right now, to further develop the application. So we did the pilot in Ecuador, and as Christian said, you know, the miners and others were able to provide feedback. It needs refinement. It needs further work. You know, it was a great pilot, but it's a pilot, so of course we have to improve. And we will be continuing to work with ARM over the next couple of months to refine the app. And once it's refined and once we have it, you know, version 2, we will be supporting training for the other planetGOLD countries on the use of the app. So I just wanted to point out, this isn't the end of the story for this app. This is just step 1 of its development.
Thank you, Susan, for that, for clarifying this. I believe that some of the points or the questions that were in the chat, I would like to very quickly tackle them. And I thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. How long did the application tool take to make? Well, the truth is it was work that took maybe 4 or 5 months. I hope I'm not wrong. There was a prior assessment of possible offerors for these type of technological instruments. And so that search and selection took us about 2-3 months. And then we had an initial preparation on the planetGOLD criteria and the other tools for about a month or so. And the field implementation out in the field also took us about a month as well until we got the planetGOLD Ecuador team help and we assessed the organizations. We implemented the tool out in the field. So we could say roughly about 5 months altogether, but with the preparation and then actual kickoff.
I think also, Christian, and I guess for Susan as well, Elizabeth is asking if the app is for only operations or for individuals. But I believe right now the pilot was created for the operations themselves and not individuals. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you very much for that, Mona. And I'm sorry I didn't read the whole thing. Now, with regard to this point, I think it's important to point out as well that in principle, it can be used, or we're hoping that in the future, after we improve upon what Susan was mentioning about, in other words, to take this pilot tool and use it for mining groups as well as for small scale miners as well and artisanal miners. So there's an important technological challenge, as I mentioned before. Unfortunately, for some organizations that are based more on artisanal work, their implementation might be a little more complex. So it's important to fortify this through training and capacity building. But that would be my answer regarding these 2 points. Thank you. Elizabeth, how much did it cost the miners in Machala? No, it didn't cost them anything at all. Actually, within the consultancy, we had set forth conducting this exercise. So what we needed from the miners was just their interest in participating and the commitment for all the steps that I explained previously. That was it. Thank you.
I think we could take one more question in the chat, and I see from Dr. Khan, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you would like to initiate conversations about. If you want to come off mute, feel free to elaborate on your question.
Am I audible to you, ma'am?
We can hear you, but if you want to speak a little bit closer to your mic, it'd be better.
Am I audible now?
Yes, there.
So see, I am about to go to site gold mine site visit in Eritrea. So I just want to know how to initiate interactions with the artisanal miners there. I am from United Arab Emirates, so I don't know how to initiate interaction with artisanal miners in order to understand, what kind of problem they are facing by doing artisanal mining, what kind of precautions they are taking in terms of not to use mercury, and what are the governmental help they are getting from their respective countries in Asia, in Africa. So these are my basic questions. I would be glad if you please put some light on this.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for that. This is Susan speaking. Thank you for that question. That's as I think Rosanna had said on a previous to a previous question. That's a big question. How do you even begin to engage minors? And it is not easy. First, you have to find them, and you have to develop their trust. Listen to them. Some of them are worried about talking to you because they're unsure of their legal situation, etc. So my advice would actually be to partner with an organization that has experience in working with small scale miners. So for example, the Alliance for Responsible Mining, 11 Sources, there are others, Impact, Artisanal Gold Council. There are a number of NGOs and other organizations that have, and social enterprises. I know that 11 Sources is a social enterprise that have significant experience in these initial encounters with miners and have very experienced staff who then can partner with you rather than you trying to take the burden on yourself. That would be my best recommendation because it's a really difficult thing to do. And it's really, something that you need to be careful and do correctly with that so you don't scare people off. And
Thank you, ma'am.
any of those contacts, of course, we're happy to. You can contact us or any of the people on this call for further information.
I would be glad if you please share the PPTs with me because I have to leave for another meeting in 5 minutes, ma'am.
Okay, you'll be able to find all the information on this from this call, including the recording, will be on our planetGOLD website, and we'll be circulating that information to anyone who registered for the event.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions here or any hands raised. So just being aware of the time, I would just want to thank Christian and Kami and Jara and Rosanna and the interpreters for today, for all your work today, prepping for it and for delivering it. Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who joined. And yes, we will circulate the presentation and the recording on the planetgold.org website once we have all of that together, but appreciate all of you being here. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening and day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Ms. Mona.
Christian. Gracias a ustedes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. They're saying
Thank
as
you.
well. Thank you all
you.
from the interpreters group as well. Thank you.